Okay, so thank you very much, Desmond. The interesting part about Desmond Morris making that talk is because when I first became aware of the aquatic ape hypothesis, it was because of one of Desmond Morris's books called The Naked Ape, which was quite a big seller in the 60s and the 70s. It was actually a bit sexist, to be honest, and in the 60s and the 70s people were quite sensitive to that sort of thing. So a woman called Elaine Morgan actually wrote an alternative version of the Naked Ape, which she called The Descent of Woman, and instead of taking the male perspective that Morris was taking, she took the female perspective and looked at all the problems that the females had to overcome. And most interestingly, Desmond Morris now speaking about the aquatic ape hypothesis, because even he's been convinced by the veracity of this argument, which is why I show you this one rather than the savanna hypothesis. They make the point, though, that a lot of our evolution in this sense was related to the sea. It was related to being in seawater. And I think that there's a couple of paradoxes in that. The first thing is that we can't survive only on seawater. We can't drink seawater. It's not something that we can get by on. The second thing is that we don't even really like the feel of seawater on our skin, and if we do go to the beach for a holiday or something like this, what will happen is that we'll come out of the sea and we'll actually wash the salt off. We'll take a shower because we like fresh water, not salt water. It says to me that the aquatic phase of our development was probably in fresh water, not salt water. And what this slide shows you is the way another species emerged because of floods that happened in the Congo plain. We know about chimpanzees and we know about gorillas. Only recently do we know about a third species, which are known as bonobos, Panpaniscus. They're only discovered recently as 1929. Why they're a different species is because of the way that the floods happened in the Congo basin. And what happened is that the floods water comes up, the flood water comes down. And as far as the bonobos was concerned, when the flood water went away, they found themselves on the southern bank of the river where no gorillas were and where no other chimpanzees were. And in the northern bank, that's where the chimpanzees and the gorillas carried on coexisting. That simple switch meant that their lifestyles could be very different. Chimpanzees are quite aggressive when they meet each other. They're ruled by dominant animals that are aggressive to everybody. The reason for this is because they have to go and forage in different parts of the forest during the day and only coming back to meet up together towards the end of the night. They have to forage away because the gorillas are eating all the easily available undergrowth. On the southern part of the Congo, the gorillas aren't there. So what it means is that the bonobos can just stroll around and feed themselves as easily as they want to. So that means that socially they can stay together in their groups. It means they're a lot less aggressive. It actually means that the males are no longer the ones in charge. It means that the females are the ones in charge. These are a matriarchal species. So one flood isolates one species, a dramatic effect on behaviour. So following that thought down, to look at the way this could have affected the human species. Imagine the forest is flooded, not for a week, not for a few days, but for 1 million years. We're the species that can't get onto the high ground. We're the species that can't go to the fruit trees because that's where the chimpanzees are. We're left in the water. And water is very important when we start to talk about bipedalism, because in the savanna theory, what happens is that, yes, you can see the predator, but you can't run away very efficiently because you're not fully evolved to be bipedal yet. In the water, all that becomes much easier. The water is the supporting medium. Animals go into the water almost on tippy toes anyway, and because the water is supporting the muscles and all the other organs that need to change can change as far as that's concerned. So the thinking is that the aquatic environment was the aid and the stimulus that made us a bipedal species instead of a quadrupedal species. That's actually not so random, because every other aquatic species is also in the same plane. So if you think about a dolphin, it's all in one plane. If you think about a whale, it's all in one plane. So we're just following the same pattern that the whales and dolphins follow. And this little slide here just shows the sequence. As I can see, that what happens is that the rather hairy looking bonobo in this case goes into the water, but it's meant to represent one of our ancestral species. Cut to 1 million years, and what happens is the hairless, adapted for the water human comes out, because obviously our hairlessness is an adaptation to being in water. You don't see hairy dolphins, you don't see hairy whales, you don't see hairy humans in all over their bodies, so that tells us that we're an aquatic species. Okay, so the thing about floods is that eventually they go away. Okay, so eventually the floods will go away, and floods are always followed by a drought. So we're talking a cycle here of flooding and droughting. Initially a flood for a long time, and then much more rapid cycling. And the historical record, the geological record of the Congo Basin tells us this is what happened. So what does that mean for our species then? Well, what it means is that we're adapted for the water, and then suddenly the water starts to go away. So what we've got to do is to start to do things very, very differently. The drought also explains another paradox about our species, that we need fish in our diet. So we actually need the omega oils that come from fish. Ask yourself, how does a primate species living in a forest come to start to eat fish? I mean, you don't develop a fishing rod before you develop a taste for the fish, so there's got to be some other reason for it. And the drought would be the reason that explains that, at least in my mind. What happens is that as the water recedes, you're left with ponds and pools. All those fish, this happens even now, go into those ponds and pools. So there we are, we're a species, we're opportunistic, we'll eat most things, we'll try most things. Oh look, there's a pool full of fish, let's just stick your hand in and eat them. And suddenly there's the most richest available food source that you could possibly imagine. The water dries out even more, we start to migrate, we start to go onto the savannah. So the savannah theory isn't wrong, it's just not the explanation for everything that's going on. And that's when we started our move towards the sea, because it was still more moist and so on. So what this slide shows you is the food substances that we require. This is the stuff that we have to have, but our bodies no longer make for themselves. That they need it, but they can have the luxury of not making it for themselves, because there's so much of it in the environment, at least the evolutionary environment, that we no longer have to make it. So what is it? Well, it's vitamin Bs, that's coming from meat and so on. It's iodine coming from fish. It's the fatty acids and so on, also coming from fish. And clearly we need fruits as well. So the patterns of the demands of our body tells us that what we had was a primate type fruit phase, a phase where all we did was eat a lot of fish, and then now into the more modern era where we can eat meat and so on as well. And again, that's not uniquely human, because chimpanzees will also go hunting, they will also eat meat. In fact, that's the only food that they will share with each other. We also had a period of scavenging as well. The idea that humans were hunters isn't quite a clean-cut one, because before we started killing our own food, what we did was to scavenge the meat off others. And this slide shows you an electron micrograph, and the electron micrograph shows very clearly that we were scavengers, because that big scar along the bone just there, that's actually made by the tooth mark of a predator. That second line that you can see going this way is a much finer line made by a stone tool. So what's happened is the predators killed the animal, and then the ancestral humans come along and used a stone tool to peel off the leftover meat. So scavengers as well. Here are some examples of the stone tools, and as you can see, they go back millions of years, and you can presume that there were going to be wooden tools before that. And as we become forward in time, those stone tools become more and more complicated, in fact very, very sophisticated. This one I'm not sure if you can see, but it actually shows you on a mammoth's tusks the carving of a mammoth made by our ancestral species. And this final slide here just runs through the advancements and the technological advancements that we've made as a species. Stone tools 2 or 3 million years ago, butchery for the reasons I've shown you with the marks on the bones. Fire, we can tell because it changes the magnetism of the rocks, and so we know when man was making fire. Scalping, well again you can use your imagination to see where the evidence for that is. Wooden tools, having said wooden tools, those are only the ones that survive, because remember wood doesn't fossilise, so we know there was wood there, but wood would have preceded the stone tools without a doubt as well. And then finally burial. We bury our dead. We don't just discard them in the street, we bury them. How do we know that our ancestral species did the same thing? Well, because you look not only at the fossil remains, but you look at the substances that are around it, you look at the matrix around it. And what you find in the matrix immediately around the body is about 5 million times more pollen seeds and pollen grains in the matrix around the body than you see a metre either side of it. What does that tell you? It tells you there's a hole in the ground, there's a body in it, and they put flowers on the body there in exactly the same way as we do. So that brings to an end the third part of this podcast, and what it's done is to try and put the unique characteristics of humans in context and trying to give you some sort of reasonable explanation about how this could have happened. So the discussion point for the end of the third part of the podcast is, how would we be different as a species if we hadn't gone through this aquatic phase? So just try and imagine what we would be like as a species if we hadn't have gone through the water phase.